Hi everybody, you're through to Hannah at another episode with Chris Humphreys of Meet the Author. Thank you very much for joining us today. I've got a few questions to ask Chris, and we're going to be briefly discussing his career as well as the book that he's written recently, The Hunt of the Unicorn. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself other than that?
Sure. Well, hello. Thank you so much for having me on your show here. I'm, as Hannah said, Chris Humphreys. I actually have various names and wear various hats because I'm an actor as well as Chris Humphreys and a playwright, but I'm also a historical fiction writer as C.C. Humphreys. So there's various caps. And I'm a actor, a playwright, a novelist, sometimes a fight choreographer, and also these days I'm doing an awful lot of audiobook narration, which was a good little pivot, as the word of the day is, to be able to do that in lockdown. I have a studio, which is a very grand name for a duvet fort, just down in my hut. So that's been good. That's been keeping me in business, basically, along with the writing, of course, because I'm always writing.
Fantastic. Yes, lockdown's been really tricky for everybody. So it's been brilliant that you've been able to keep yourself, going through this time. So the questions that I've got for you today, there are a variety. There's only 10 because I don't like it to go on and on and on and bore you to tears too much. So my first question for you today was, when did your writing journey begin?
Yeah, it's always a slightly difficult question to answer because does it begin with the desire or does it begin with the actual words on a page? I had a sense of wanting to be a writer from quite an early age, but what I really do is, and as my self-description really indicated, I tend to regard myself as a storyteller. And I've been telling stories all my life. As a kid, I was the kid, the organizing force in any group of kids, getting them to pretend to be cowboys or knights or Vikings or whatever, and playing these amazing improvisational games. That's what we did, of course. No screens, right? When I was a young man. So we had to do that all ourselves. So I was the kid who did that, made up the stories. And usually they were adventurous and swashbuckling stories. I fell in love with the sword at a very early age, that dominated a lot of things. So I was into the swashbuckling type tales of daring do. And then in terms of writing itself, didn't really do much at my school in England, where I grew up in London. I mean, there was not a lot of, it was more a university factory rather than a creative. There were some very fine teachers there who pushed me slightly, but I didn't really. I mean, I dabbled in writing. I kept a very intense journal in my 20s, and dabbled in the odd thing. But what I didn't understand in those days, and it's kind of what I teach now because I do teach creative writing quite a bit, is I didn't understand about process. I didn't understand that each stage is different, and that the first stage of the process is just about getting the idea out. I thought it had to be good straight away. It doesn't. Right? So eventually, my problem, therefore, was finishing things. I'd start with enthusiasm and write some interesting stuff for a couple of hours, then go, no, it's not quite like my favorite playwright stroke novelist. And so I would abandon them. And then one day, I was living in Canada by then. I'd come to Vancouver in the early 90s, and I saw a sign for a 24-hour playwriting competition. And which literally in those days meant going into a room with 2 pages of notes and writing a play from 5:30 on a Friday night to 5:30 on a Saturday night, staying there, not going home. Wow. And so I thought, well, gosh, at least I'll finish something. That was my sole ambition. So I went in and I wrote this play called A Cage Without Bars. And it was like a lot of first works. It was snatched from the trauma of my own love life at the time in the early 90s. A very dramatic but rather sad event that occurred to me, and wrote that play, and finished it. Thought, oh, that's it, objective achieved. But then I won the competition, and they gave me $500. So I thought, oh God, I'm a professional writer now, and they put it on. So and then the following year, I was commissioned to write another play, which I did in Calgary in Canada, and so suddenly I had 2 plays, and I started writing a 3rd play. But what I really wanted to do was write historical fiction. That was where I'd lived as a kid. That's what I read. I loved it. And I'd had this idea about the man who killed Anne Boleyn. Now, you're nodding, so you probably know, French swordsman brought over from France to do the kind deed. Henry was being so kind to his soon-to-be ex-wife by bringing a swordsman in. Anyway, I just wondered about him. And I wondered what happened next, What if he not only took her head, but he took her six-fingered hand as well? She asks him to get rid of this hand. It's the mark of the witch. It's powerful in itself. It will be used against me and my surviving daughter and all that. So he agrees to do that. But then, of course, because it's so powerful, the villain, the Archbishop of Siena, steals it and leaves Jean Rambeau, dangling in a gibbet cage. And then, of course, the whole book's about getting the hand back. So anyway, I had that idea. But then I, of course, didn't think I could write it because a play was kind of like a hill, but a novel was a mountain. And then, so it took me, but I kept researching it for 6 years. I kept thinking, well, if I ever write that novel, it's going to have this in it and this in it. Battle at sea between slave galleys, black mass in an archbishop's dungeon, the Palio in Siena, that sort of thing. And so I kept researching it. And then finally, after about 6 years, I picked up this book on mercenaries because I knew most of the characters would be mercenaries. And I started reading, I thought, I just got to write this. And I sat down and started writing it. Of course, once I did, 90% of the research was useless, well, not useless, but just not applicable. And I wrote it fast in 10 months, got an agent immediately, got it sold to Orion 2 months later. And that was the beginning of my writing career. And The French Executioner and its sequel, Blood Ties, came out. They commissioned me for the Jack Absolute series after that, and on it went. And now I've written 22 novels in 21 years. So.
That's absolutely fantastic. And it sounds like it's been a real journey for you as well. So you started off with historical fiction and now you are actually writing. I think one of my questions was about the historical novels that you've written, but now you're writing more fantasy, and it seems like you had an interest in fantasy, mixing it with the historical element, which The Hunt of the Unicorn is pretty much all about, mixing the two. I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yes, I've always sort of done that with my. I mean, it was slightly bracing to realize that because I always thought I was a historical novelist, but I've actually written 9 fantasy novels, and so I'm both. That's that, and I am interested in fantasy, but my stuff is more, as you say, historical fantasy. Even French Executioner, with the ghost of Anne Boleyn wandering about, stuff and magic happens, is a historical fantasy, really. And I've written a lot of straight historical as well. But yeah, no, I've liked that, and I've liked the fact that you can mix in elements. My first so-called fantasy series, I call it more Earth Magic, the Runestone Saga, about time travel and runes, runic magic, and so it's more about what some people would call magic. I just call the powers you draw from the Earth and the symbols of the Earth. And time travel obviously involves going down, rather than using machine, you actually go down the bloodlines of your family into the life of an ancestor. That's what happens to the protagonist in that book, and keeps happening in the 3 books. So yes, I mean, we're going to talk about Hunt of the Unicorn. I mean, that has more a historical bent, as well as being, dealing with unicorns and dragons and manticores and all the myths of our world, which exist as reality in this other world, Goloth. I have written, I'm in the throes of writing still, because I'm just waiting for the notes for book 3, a trilogy for Gollancz, who are one of the top fantasy publishers in the world, sci-fi and fantasy, called the Immortals Blood trilogy. And my first book in that's called Smoke in the Glass. And that is high epic fantasy. So it's got no connections with our world, except that the worlds within that world, and there are actually 4, are loosely based on recognizable human history, such as there's a kind of Viking world called Midgard, there's a sort of Byzantine world called Corinthium, and there's a Mesoamerican world called Ometepe. And those 3 worlds sort of clash and come together. And at the core of each of them are immortals. The immortals are kind of like the 1% who rule everything. And so that is more I suppose would be classified as more straightforward fantasy, but of course my stuff is never that straightforward. So
well, I found that with the Hunt of the Unicorn there's lots of different elements, so you've managed to incorporate a parallel world alongside a modern contemporary world, and this parallel world is medieval, but it still runs perfectly alongside. It's not like it's in the past of our world or in the historical throes of our world, and I liked that. It called to me, and I felt that was really interesting that you managed to get that across quite clearly. It wasn't like it was muddy or anything. It was quite obvious. It's almost like a parallel world that has a gate that you can cross over, and time seems to run alongside ours. Is that accurate, would you say?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a good description. A bit of a model for me was Narnia, of course. You know, the wardrobe that you can get. In my case, and this is one of the things that made me want to write the book, was when I discovered the Unicorn Tapestries, which are these phenomenal. I mean, if your viewers are at all interested, just go onto the website of the Museum of Museum of Metropolitan Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and they have a medieval wing called the Cloisters, which is a fantastic place in New York. And it's completely medieval, really, as a museum. And they have the extraordinary Unicorn Tapestries there. And once I discovered them and started falling in love with what tapestries were, actually, because they blew me away. I had no inkling of them before. I knew I had my gateway to another world, and that the weaver of those, because no one knows who actually wove them or who for or how much they cost or where they were woven, which is great for me, right? I can just slip in there and no one's going to challenge me. But if I made the weaver of the original tapestries the ancestor of my protagonist, Elaine, or more fully Alice Elaine, whose initials are all over the tapestries and woven in there, AE. And she is, because she is the descendant, when Moonspill, the unicorn, summons her, she is able to cross over. And you know, that what you were saying, that balance between our world, the contemporary world, and their world. What's great about having it's a concept in lots of writing, actually, where it's called introduce the innocent. You introduce the innocent who is completely oblivious to this other world, you know, and refuses to believe it to start with, has to be hallucinating, because, you know, you just don't run into manticores every day, especially when they're trying to eat you, you know, first thing that happens to her. So that was, you're able, therefore, to really explain the world, but in action. That's what I like to do. I don't like to give lots of explanation if it's not connected to the character or the action. So there's no pausing or whatever. You know, she needs to know how this world operates in order to survive it. And so that, I think, that's the way we can learn about the world, Goloth. Which is the land of the fabulous beast, where all our myths live. And I sort of posit this idea that they all lived here on our planet. But then when humans just got too good at killing them, they all decided to go back to Goloth, which is where they were from. But all the portals had kind of been closed up, you know, eventually. And Moonspill, this young wild unicorn, was the last. He was in his 20s or something, which is a kid in unicorn terms. But he was all up for adventures, because the unicorns had always had this close relationship with heroes, basically. King Arthur had ridden a unicorn, Alexander the Great had ridden a unicorn, you know, that sort of thing. And so he was seeking that sort of adventure, but then it all got too much, and all the gateways had been closed down behind the other beasts who'd gone back. And so he encounters this weaver, saves the weaver's life with unicorn powers, the healing powers, and gets the weaver to weave a new doorway, and that's the tapestry.
Yeah. I thought that was absolutely fantastic when I read about Moonspill, how you managed to give him a distinct personality. There are many fantasy novels where we have creatures and beasts where the author doesn't quite dip into that creature or beast having its own personality. Like let's just pull one out of the air, J.K. Rowling and Hedwig. There was some reference that Hedwig was her own owl, if you like, but not an actual exploration of that. And as a reader, I would have liked more of that, and I really appreciated that in this.
Oh,
but
good.
What made you decide to give Moonspill a human quality? Could you have written it in a way that was more centered around the humans rather than the animals, or like what was your inspiration for that?
Well, I wanted to strike a balance. I didn't want Moonspill to just be a human in unicorn garb. You know, he had to have his own very distinct way of being and thinking. Also, I really glommed onto the fact that, like, all fabulous beasts are monsters in the traditional sense of the word. They're not monsters. You know, they're made up of different creatures. So, you know, a unicorn is not a horse with a horn. A unicorn is a part horse, part goat. It has cloven feet and a beard and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to get a bit of that. And he's 500 years old. He's can be a bit grumpy, you know, and I want that. That's what I really focused on, was that he needed to be accessible to humans, but also very different. And in his relationship with Elaine, you know, that's something that again was able to emerge as they got to know each other, because he's, you know, he understands humans and he's related to humans before, particularly her ancestor. And you know, the original Alice Elaine, the daughter of the Weaver. But he's also sought a connection with a human. And for that, he has to put aside some of his more monstrous nature in order to access them, really, I suppose. So their coming together was a gradual dance, I thought, and that was the idea for that.
I really I thought that was really interesting how you explored that, and you actually saying that all the creatures were made up of different animals is quite accurate. You're quite clear about the description of the manticore, you know, and when you say about the unicorn, yes, it's part goat, part horse. And I feel like you might have taken that description from some of the tapestries themselves, because when I researched the tapestries just to see, I knew about it because obviously we learn about it at school, but you've actually almost taken it like, yes, they've got cloven hooves and beards and ivory horns on the tapestries, and it was just, did you take that from something inside of you, or did you take that from the tapestries as inspiration?
Like everything, it's a mix of those influences. The tapestries were hugely influential. But medieval bestiaries, you know, I looked at quite a few of those, and I read an amazing book. I wish I could remember the name of it. I think it was called The Way of the Unicorn. And it was a beautiful 19th century book about really analyzing what the unicorn means for people, you know, what it had come to symbolize, and you know, that idea that it could heal illness and cure pollution, but it also the idea that it was unconquerable except by a maiden. See, and that was one of the jumping off points for me with the book. That he needed to form a relationship with a maiden.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was I forgot what the question was. I've gone into a sideline here.
I think we were just generally natural. What was your inspiration for the very specific description? Yeah.
Well, it was very, and also I made him you know, a friend of mine, his son, when I told him I was writing about unicorns, he's a very sharp lad, he was about 11 at the time, said to me, "Oh, Chris, it's not going to be on unicorns who farts glitter, is it?" No, it's not going to be that sort of unicorn. So, you know, I was concerned to keep him monstrous in some ways, but also eventually accessible. You know, it's kind of boring if a character arrives and is fully set, you know.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's two main character narratives in that book. Well, yeah, really, basically two. And in the sequels, there's that expands, as you know. But And so both those characters needed to develop in relation to each other, really.
Yeah. I thought that was lovely how they were able to interact with each other through their minds, and it seems like it's a very unique way of describing the verbalization between unicorn and human, and is completely what I would expect, because unicorns are this symbol of escapism in magical terms, and they are fantastical, like they're a fantastical beast. And so I really loved learning about that they could talk to each other and to humans in their minds, and they had a connection and a bond with them, and they to the point where they would even know where someone had died. I just wanted to say that was a fantastic bit of the characterization of Moonspill. I really enjoyed that.
Good.
And I found it really interesting that you chose unicorns, because it seems that a lot of authors tend to shy away from them. You know, the safe beasts to write about are dragons, werewolves, vampires. They're very popular. Why unicorns is what I'm trying to get at. Why unicorns?
Can you
wow.
see?
Yeah.
That's a rampant unicorn.
Wow. Is that a proper sigil ring?
It is.
Oh, wow.
It's my family crest.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, the rampant unicorn. This was my dad's ring. He passed away a long time ago. But so it was when I was thinking of what book to write next. My editor at Knopf in New York wanted another book. I'd written Runestone Saga for her, and she said, what have you got? And I thought, fantasy or what, and I really was sitting there in my office going, I don't know, what am I going to write? Why do I wear a unicorn on my finger? What does a unicorn mean? And that's literally the hopping off point. So I then began investigating them, and I never had a fear, actually. It's funny you raise it now, but I never had a thought about, I shouldn't write about unicorns because they're been appropriated and misappropriated in so many ways, like the ones who fart glitter, right? I never occurred to me to worry about that. I just thought, right, I'm going to go to the myths, the original myths. I'm going to go to the tapestries once I discover them, which was really fast, actually. I'm going to go to them. I had the doorway. I had the idea being only tameable by a maiden. I thought, well, I'm writing, at the time, I'm not very big on saying this is a YA book or blah, 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 who it's for. I just like to write a good book. And so, a lot of Hunter the Unicorn actually was runner-up for an adult fiction prize out where I live in British Columbia in Canada. So, I'm glad people recognize that. It's not about that sort of thing for me. But I knew, having a relationship with a teenage Manhattanite, she'd give us our sort of modern eye view of this strange world, and be able to, through her journey, explain it to us. And I just never occurred to me to worry about writing about a unicorn. I was just fascinated by them as soon as I started reading about them, and thought, I'm just going to do it.
Yeah, there's not very many written in novels at all. I've read a fair amount of fantasy. I'm a big Tolkien fan, and even in something where we would imagine that fantasy stems from, there's not much mention about unicorns, if any, that from my recollection from his work. So I found that very interesting that you decided to go all whole hog into unicorns. I just thought it was fantastic. And you didn't seem to make it childish, I guess, or like you say, lots of glitter and lots of magical powers it was very mature. It was a very mature novel, and I really like that. Good. Being an adult myself.
Good, thank you.
No problem. My next question was regarding which was your favorite genre, but we've already covered that, and it's historical. So I'll just skip on to the sixth one. Is if you had to pin down your favorite novel or series that you've written thus far, which one would you say was the most that you've enjoyed writing?
Oh, it's I'm a magpie. I'm attracted to glittering things, so I can't, and it's cost me, I think, In terms of just pure, I mean, I've had a good career, but if I'd written essentially the same book 20 times, I'd probably be fabulously wealthy and living on a Caribbean beach. Because I think I'm a good writer and I can do that stuff. But it never interested me. It was the same with me as an actor. I was never interested. I mean, I played a lot of, upper middle class Brits back in the day, but then I'd suddenly get cast as something crazy, like I played a Jewish gladiator in a biblical Roman epic in the mid '80s, and suddenly people are going, "Who are you?" And I loved that because people couldn't pin me down. And it's the same as a writer. I love writing. I love ringing the changes. So to actually specify which of my books. There are some that are harder to write. My most successful novel, Vlad, The Last Confession, which is the true history of Dracula, big, intense historical fiction, yet written as a thriller, because that's kind of what I write, is thrillers. That was the hardest thing to write. So I'm not sure I enjoyed it as much. I was very proud of it by the end. There are certain characters that haunt me that I've created. A few years ago, and sadly, it only was published in Canada by Penguin Random House. It was called Chasing the Wind, and it was about a 1930s aviatrix called Roxy Lohan, and she's tough and with all about the money and stuff, and she makes a mistake of falling in love with an idealist called Jocko while they're running guns to the Ethiopians fighting Mussolini, and he gets her involved in an arts heist, and she ends up going to Berlin and during the Berlin Olympics, and I mean, she is such a fun character, she is. And I wrote it in a sort of noir stroke 1930s caper movie style. She's got all the wisecracks, and she's, so Roxy Lohan, she's a fun. That was really good fun to write. I mean, I've self-published that in various places, and that's done quite well because I've become a hybrid author now, as one must these days, really.
Yeah.
And so that's still out there. But no, it's like choosing between your children. I loved Hunt of the Unicorn. I loved Hunt of the Unicorn. It was such good fun to write. And then Hunt of the Dragon as well. Loved that. And the final book, Hunt of the Shapeshifter. So, it's impossible to answer that question, Hannah. Sorry, I can't choose between my children.
No, that's absolutely fine. Because I was just curious, because you started off with the French Executioner, as you say, and I remember reading that years and years ago when I was 13, 14, I think.
Did you?
Yeah, well, when I was in year 7, this is my strange flex that I can do with people. When I was in year 7, I read the Faustus Diary and Wernwood Diaries, Dr. Faustus. So,
right, well.
My mother was an English teacher, so I had high expectations. So yeah, I would read things like historical fiction, and I absolutely loved it. I need to reread it, obviously, again, because it's been like 17 years now. But no, that I just find it interesting to see where authors like writing and what genre they prefer, or where their heart truly lies. And as you say, you've written so many and they're all attached to you in different ways. And yes, I would imagine that writing something that was quite difficult to plan and write and whatever, you'd feel very proud of, maybe more so than something that just naturally came to you. And I find that absolutely inspiring. And a lot of our readers are budding authors and writers, and they'll find that really inspirational, I think. Which leads me on to my next question. It's about your methodology, really. When you approach writing a new book, what is your approach like in planning or methods in general?
Well, it begins with an idea. Obviously, I suppose well, sometimes it actually begins with a genre, like and a suggestion. It really, I find origin stories quite interesting. And an editor suggesting she wants another book, and there I am playing with my unicorn ring, or my former agent, since retired, Mike, saying to me, yeah, I'm finding it harder to sell historical fiction. This is about 4 years ago. Have you thought of high epic fantasy? And I went, well, like, what do you mean? Game of Thrones stuff. And I went, well, I know I could write that stuff, right? Because it's big and I give good battle, as they say. So I could do all that. And I'm a swordsman. So I thought, but I wasn't interested in just doing the same thing. So, for example, that book, I just sat down with a note. Once he suggested it, I sat down with a notepad and wrote the word immortality in the center of a page. For some reason, immortality just hit me. And then I started riffing off that with little word bubbles and stuff. And within an hour, I had a 3-page treatment. And then I fleshed it out and I wrote some, chapters and stuff. Because these days it's not like it was before. In the good old days, it's much harder to get a contract now with a big publisher. And whereas before, I could always have lunch with my editor and write one sentence out on a napkin. Now it's like 6 chapters and a detailed treatment and all that stuff. So that process then becomes slightly harder in terms of, yeah, I mean, it is harder because it's not my preference. My preference is, and this is what I teach about what I mentioned before about process, is to the first draft for me is an exploration, and it's not to be read by anyone else. It's me telling myself the story and more specifically, letting the characters tell the story. So I liken it to a mountain. This is the class I teach. The mountain, the novel is a series of ascents, and the first ascent is this mad free climb and don't look down being one of the rules. Good and bad, absolutely nowhere to be seen in your vocabulary. Just keep going up, and you get to the top, and you go, "Oh, that was good. Oh, that wasn't so good. Oh, I could have done that. Why didn't I go over there? Oh, okay." But you've got what's happened during that first ascent is that the characters have developed, and it's very, very important to me.
Yeah,
for the characters to dictate the plot as much as possible. Now, of course, it's ingenuous to say they just created entirely, particularly with historical fiction, because you have historical events you're attaching the narrative to, or the character's journeys to. But it is. I like the word oscillation. It's an oscillation back and forth between the needs of the character, the needs of history, the needs of the plot, and so that's how I go. And I just pretty much blast out a first draft.
Fantastic.
And then I have time, and then at the end of the first draft, it's the first time I do an outline. I don't do an outline to start. I do an outline at the end of the first draft, looking at what I've done. I wrote a chart on butcher's paper and stick it on a cork board, and it's chapter number, title, what the action of it, and then notes. Well, if that person does that there, then I write the note. Well, I have to factor that in back in chapter 3. I have to plant that or whatever. That's when I get more analytical. But separating out the process is what I think stops a lot of people writing, because they think it has to be good or whatever. Yeah. So that's essentially my methodology. And then I do a second draft. The second ascent up the mountain is really making the book as good as I can make it. I suppose I use the word good there, but certainly as true to my vision as I can make it. And then laying a route up the mountain for the editor to climb with you. And then they climb with you.
Yeah.
And then you look down from the top and go, and they usually go, "Wow, that was brilliant, but listen, we could do that, or how about this?" And that's it. And then you do the third draft. I mean, some areas get 10 drafts, but you know what I mean. Basically, the third draft.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I know quite a few of people when they write their stories. I see lots of Instagram posts and blog posts about it. When they write their stories, they really struggle with how they approach the story. Whether they outline it, do they just go with the flow as a pantser, as they say, or what? So that's really useful to know, someone who's written 20 odd books, to know what your method is. And I feel like a lot of people might get a lot of inspiration from that, and you utilize that to according to their approach and everything.
Right.
Brill. So my next question was, your career has been one of a very creative nature through the arts and acting and through your writing. Have you ever considered being part of a collaboration, whether it be through co-authoring or anything? You mentioned screenplays, and I was initially going to ask that, but earlier on you didn't mention that you wrote some screenplays. Well, theatre production plays, was it?
Yeah. I mean, I have written screenplays, but it's not my speciality. Theatre is where I began, and I still return to that periodically. But yeah, well, I'm a big believer in collaborative art. And even a novel is a collaboration, of course, because you're working with an editor often, and sometimes some beta readers and things like that. But the collaborative arts more. I mean, I'm used to that because of acting. Putting on a play or even TV show is a collaborative effort, and you just have to do your part of that collaboration as well as you can. With playwriting, it's a collaboration again, which can work well or not, depending on who you collaborate with. I've had both experiences. I've had great experiences and absolutely terrible experiences with people trying to tell me what my play should be. But I like the nature of collaboration. I don't think I wouldn't write a collaborative novel. Well, never say never, but I doubt I would. And I wouldn't, I think the limits of my collaboration would be something like a play again, or something like that.
That's fantastic.
Screenplays again. I think one of the reasons I've avoided screenplays is that I know, it is an absolute rule of Hollywood or wherever they're making films that you will get rewritten.
Yeah.
And sometimes extensively, and so I've avoided it a bit. I have adapted a couple of my novels. I wrote the screenplay for French Executioner, and because a producer commissioned it and asked me to. And then I also wrote a screenplay for Plague, my novel about the Great Plague, religious fundamentalist serial killer story set in the Great Plague of London with its sequel Fire. I wrote a 6-part, I wrote a treatment for a 6-part, and I wrote the first episode of an hour's worth of Plague. I actually quite enjoy it, I must say. It's a very different discipline. And you see how, you've got to find a very different way of telling the story. So
brilliant. Okay, brilliant. Well, that sounds absolutely fantastic. Well, my final question for you, Chris, before we do the giveaway at the end, is for those budding authors and other creatives, what's your best piece of advice that you could give them for writing or creating in general?
Well, it goes back to what I've been banging on about, actually, which is understand that it's a process. It really is almost that cliche now of a journey, not a destination. Eventually it'll be a destination. Eventually it'll be a book held in your hot little hand, right? But separating out the stages of the journey, not jumping ahead to the launch party and Steven Spielberg optioning it, not doing that. And when I talk about the mountain, it means metaphorically, literally, how do I get to the top of the mountain? Well, I can't. It's impossible. But I can get just there where there's a finger hold and you're off the ground, right? So allowing your characters, putting your character into action, something I teach as well, character in action, and letting them tell you who they are. And letting them tell the story. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to have points along the way you want to reach. But I would, it depends on the genre a bit. With historical fiction, I tend to research for a few months and then dive in, as opposed to 6 years, and then discover most of it's not worthwhile. But with fantasy, it's a little different because you're kind of making it all up to start. But yeah, so just understand it's a process. It's about putting this foot in front of the other foot, and just moving forward.
That's really important. I think a lot of young writers and a lot of inexperienced writers might get a little bit overwhelmed by whether they feel that it's not meeting XYZ need or expectations of other people if they give it to like a beta reader, for example. I've heard of some beta readers being quite stuffy about certain drafts, and that's always the worry about giving your work over to someone to read and analyze. It's quite, you're putting your heart on the line. So that's actually a really important piece of advice, is just to kind of go with the flow and understand where it's got to go That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, no worries at all. No, I mean, you know, it's the one of the other rules about my method is never show your first draft to anyone.
Yeah.
because then it becomes about it's breaking the process. It's about making someone understand, as opposed to finding out what the story is yourself.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. That's quite, I would say that's almost one of the most important things when writing a novel then, in that regard, because you have to be able to get it out into a several million draft stage to be able to understand it. And that could be actually really helpful for some of our watchers and readers. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris.
Yeah,
and before we close it today, you said that you had a giveaway.
Yes, I have, well, two to your sharpest listeners, readers, viewers. I have done as I mentioned, I'm making a lot of my living as an audiobook narrator, and mostly that's for other people, but I have also recorded a few of my own. And I've recorded The Hunt of the Unicorn, in fact, the novel we've been talking about most. And you can get it from, a place called Findaway Voices. I'll send you all the links, but what I'll do is I'll send you a giveaway code to two of your two. Is two good?
Two, yeah.
Yeah, and you can post those. Do they need to answer a question to get it, or they just sort of be hot off the press?
I think it might be more fair to do a random hat choice, I think. Fantastic. So then we can have a few selections, and anybody who gets picked out of the hat randomly then can get it. I think that'd be nice and fair.
Fabulous. And with the giveaway there, Findaway Voices, it's quite good because you don't even need to be a subscriber to Audible or anything like that. You can, I have something there called Authors Direct, which is a shop front. You can literally download it to anything.
Brilliant. Nice. Sounds really easy then. So with that, everybody, if you message me, and then I'll be able to get the codes from Chris and we can sort it out there. Just DM me. I'm on Twitter and social media and Instagram, obviously. And Chris, do you want to blurt out your social media handles and your website and do a bit of promo?
Sure. I'm authorchrishumphreys.com is my website. I'm at HumphreyCC is my Twitter handle. I'm at c.c.humphreys is my Instagram. And there's an author Facebook page, which I can't remember, but I think if you just found Chris Humphreys, you'd find it quite quick. So yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for today, Chris. Really do appreciate it, with all the advice and the interesting insights that you've given us to the way that you work and your mind. We really do appreciate it. So hopefully we'll be able to have a catch up later in the future.
That would be great, Hannah. Thank you so much. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been
no problem. Thank you so much. Everybody have a lovely weekend, wherever you are in the world, and stay safe, okay? Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.